tindagalima batata, vigilanga tindagalima batata. Vigilanga tindagalima batata, vigilanga tindagalima batata, vigilanga tindagalima batata.
Welcome, everyone, to our event, The Stories Behind the Stories, Dispatches of Hope from the Front Lines of Climate Change. Thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Kevin Perkins, and I am the Executive Director at Farm Radio International. And I'm joining you today from the city of Ottawa, where Farm Radio International's Canadian office is located on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. The name Ottawa derives from the Algonquin word Ottawa, which means trade, and indeed, this has always been an important place of trade, a place where people meet and gather to exchange and share products, but also ideas and stories. And so it is a fitting location from which to host an exchange of stories, like we're doing this evening. In particular, inspiring stories about communities that are responding with courage and creativity to the challenges posed by climate change. And who better to participate in this exchange than emerging storytellers, students of journalism from Carleton University. Now I want to introduce you to Tara Sprickerhoff, my colleague, and Farm Radio's Senior Communications Specialist. She herself started as a journalism student at Carleton. As a young reporter, she worked with Farm Radio International as an intern in Ghana, sharing stories about the impact of radio there. In 2018, Tara joined our team here in Ottawa, growing our communication outreach to donors across Canada. Last spring, Tara joined students from Carleton University's Journalism School to witness our work in both Zambia and Cote d'Ivoire, Zambia and Cote d'Ivoire, with our project called Nature-Based Solutions. It's a project where we are sharing inspiring stories of how rural communities are adapting to climate change in partnership with nature. She's now mentoring the students as they produce stories for a podcast that we're producing called Nature Answers. Tara, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thanks so much, Kevin. So it's a pleasure for me to be with you all today. As Kevin mentioned, this is a bit of a fun full circle moment for me. I began my career as a young journalist with Farm Radio International as an intern in Ghana. So it's really neat to be working with these students as they do much the same thing as I did almost, a decade ago. So to begin, I'd like to introduce the three journalists we have with us today. Each of them spent 3 months this summer working for Farm Radio International on a podcast episode, or 3 podcast episodes, for our podcast Nature Answers: Rural Stories from a Changing Planet. So with us today, we have Sarah St. Pierre. Sarah is a Master's of Journalism student at Carleton University. She's originally from Drummondville, Quebec, and her undergrad is in International Development Studies from McGill, where she graduated in 2023. So Sarah spent the summer with us in Zambia. Everett Linguist is our second panelist today. He'll graduate in 2025 with a Bachelor of Journalism and Humanities from Carleton University. He's originally from Victoria, British Columbia, and Everett spent the summer working from Farm Radio International's office in Uganda. And finally, our final speaker today is Adam Tripp. Adam is also a master's student in journalism at Carleton University. He completed his undergrad in English at the University of Guelph and also spent the summer in Zambia. So welcome all three of you. Before we begin, I should mention that this program is part of a larger project that we're working on in partnership with and thanks to Global Affairs Canada. We're also partnering with Carleton University to make these internships available to their students. So the project itself is called On Air for Gender Inclusive Nature-Based Solutions. You'll often hear it referred to as the Nature-Based Solutions Project. And it has three major goals. So the first is that we're working with local journalists in 6 different countries to find stories of individuals and communities that are using nature-based solutions to adapt to climate change. I've thrown that term around a few times now, so I should mention that nature-based solutions are solutions to climate change that take lessons learned from nature to both improve biodiversity and benefit the communities themselves. So the broadcasters that we're partnering with turn these stories into powerful documentaries as well as how-to guides so that other communities can hear the solutions that their neighbors are trying out and testing and give it a try themselves. The second thing that this project is doing is that we're polling rural communities about the changes they're seeing in their homes due to climate change, what barriers are preventing them from adapting to the changing climate, and also taking what those communities have to say, those answers to those questions, and bringing them to decision makers and policymakers to address so that these larger systemic issues around climate change can also be changed or addressed in a way that isn't just up to the individuals or the communities themselves. Finally, and this is what we're digging into today, we're also looking at the stories that come from this project and trying to bring them to a global audience and to audiences here in Canada so that Canadians themselves can be inspired by these stories of climate change adaptation and take action themselves. It's important, in this climate that we act as a global community, and this is really where these students come in. So part of their jobs this summer was to work with the broadcasters I just mentioned to learn about the stories that they were covering, the things they were seeing in their communities, and then turn those stories into episodes for our Nature Answers podcast. So before we hear from these students, I just want to mention that we'll be taking questions from you towards the end of my conversation with Sarah, Everett, and Adam. There's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and my colleague Brenda is keeping an eye on the chat. So if you'd like to pose a question when it occurs to you, we'll take note of it and ask it at the appropriate moment later on. So welcome everyone, and welcome Sarah, Everett, and Adam. Enough of me speaking. I'm sure you'd much rather hear from our panelists. So as I mentioned, all three of them spent the summer in either Uganda or Zambia. And I should mention that they weren't alone. Everett was there with 2 others, and we also sent students this year to Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. But the first question that I want to ask you three, or at least 2 of you, can you give me what was your first impression about arriving in the country? So maybe Adam, I'll go to you first. What was your first impression about arriving in Zambia?
What I found really interesting and what really stuck with me as that very first moment was how welcoming it was. There was this immediate sense of, you're with us. We're going to take care of you, right? That idea that, they just met me the first time we were meeting in person, but immediately they were very cordial. They were very helpful. They were if I could feel right away that they were looking out for myself and Sarah the second we touched down. So I think that very instant connection has stuck with me to this day.
Lovely. Thanks, Adam. Everett, you were in a different part of the continent, in a different country. What were your first impressions about arriving in Uganda?
Absolutely. First of all, I would always chat with people there saying Ugandans are hustlers, always on the move, always making the most of the small opportunities they get. What really struck me at the beginning was the density and the fact that in a space the size of a ticket booth shack, there people would be having entire family business businesses running out of there. Huge opportunity from small spaces. And I think what also really struck me was how tech savvy Ugandans actually are. It might not be something we associate with a country like that. However, things like their mobile money system, where they can use their phones without data or Wi-Fi to make payment transactions, was something that I have never seen in other parts of the world before. Above all, Ugandans are some of the best communicators I have seen. It's very hard to leave a table from a conference or something without kind of being on the same page and knowing what's happening. And of course, the weather and the climate came up a lot. I think people there are really conscious about the fact that seasons are shifting in terms of when it should be dry and when it should be rainy. And that's on everyone's minds there a lot.
Amazing, thank you. So we sent you to this country, we put you down in an office. Everett was based in the Farm Radio International's Ugandan office in Kampala. Adam and Sarah were placed with our partners, MISA Zambia, so that's the Media Institute of Southern Africa, who we partner with on the Nature-Based Solutions project. So you end up in our offices, you've settled in a little bit, you've bought the necessities of living in that country. But as I mentioned before, you're there to contribute an episode to the Nature Answers podcast. And so this podcast is about how communities in sub-Saharan Africa are successfully adapting to climate change. So, you're new in this country, you've got a lot of work to do. So how did you go about determining what stories you would do? And what interested you in the story you chose? So Sarah, we haven't heard your voice yet, so maybe I'll start with you.
Sure, thank you. So I think Adam and I were fortunate, like Adam was saying, our hosts, Misa, a lot of them are former journalists, so they were very much tuned into what we needed in order to find out what story we wanted to follow. And they had set it up for us that they were going to take us on the road for 2 weeks, traveled through the eastern, southern, and western provinces, and just meet a whole bunch of people, talk to community listening groups that the partner radios were working with, and see what we wanted to focus our episodes on. And then we would later travel back and actually do the work of properly recording and doing those interviews. And as we sort of went out on the road and started talking to people, it became pretty clear in my mind that the drought that was happening in Zambia, or that had happened during the previous rainy season, was sort of the big story that was affecting everyone. And for context, the rainy season in Zambia is about during our winter here in Canada. And last year, the drought was the worst one in 40 years. They were calling it the worst drought in a generation. And there had been droughts in the years before, but this one really had devastating impacts on small-scale farmers, which were the people that we were meeting through this. And then eventually, throughout talking to these farmers and how they felt about the drought, we met Cornwell Hademu, who became sort of the key person in my episodes. He's a small-scale farmer in Choma, which is a sort of mid-sized city in a mid-sized town in southern province of Zambia. And he was witnessing people around him sort of change their minds about climate change over time. And so I have a clip of him here talking about this, and I'll let you hear it from him.
Starting in 2015, they felt it, they saw it, they got hungry because of climate change. 2019, the country again went through severe drought, where they had to depend on government for handouts, for food. Here we are, 4, 5 provinces have no food. So everybody now has accepted that the climate has changed.
And so that was his experience and what he noticed. But also he was a victim of that drought in 2015 that he mentioned at the start of that clip, because at that time his crops all failed and he had to sort of start from nothing. And he decided to try out sustainable agriculture as a way out of that. And he credits that for how well his farm actually made it through the last drought. Compared to everyone else we met, like he was kind of a weird success story weird in the terms that it was unique and it went against everyone else. But once you talk to him, it makes a lot of sense. But yeah, so what made me pick his story was the fact that he just didn't stop at having the way out of the drought. He really made it his mission to help others learn how to do this sustainable agriculture. So that's how I picked mine.
Amazing. We'll hear a little bit more about that story later on, but before we get there, I'm going to pass the microphone to Adam. So you were in the same country as Sarah, you doing a similar trip. So how did you pick your story and how did you make sure it was different from what Sarah was doing?
One thing that I think really was kind of a through line for me when I was picking my story was I want the story to be about climate change, but I also want it to be about people, right? I think that was very important to me. And while there were many different groups. The Malili Women's Cooperative, which is what my episode is on, really stood out to me as this very tight-knit group of women in Chicankata, also in Southern Province. And to me, hearing them talk about their experiences with farming and how much they've come to rely and trust and support and work with each other really stuck with me. I think even to the point when Sarah and I, in a kind of collaborative sense, were like pitching ideas back and forth. I think I just kept coming back to that group saying like, there's some X factor that they had that I thought really stuck with me. And I think at that point, if I hadn't gone with them, I think I would have regretted it because I think it was just such a memorable group of people.
Lovely. I'm looking forward to hearing about them a little bit more as well. Everett, different country, different context. How about you? How did you go about determining what stories you would do or what story you would do?
Yeah, ahead of my time in Uganda, I realized that even at the national government level, Ugandans take a lot of pride in their wetlands. They put out every few years a master list of all the wetlands, and not just about their ecological value, but also acknowledging the challenges that a lot of them face with degradation from farming and elements such as drought. So I realized the wetlands are also incredibly important to parts of Canada. I grew up right next to various bird sanctuaries in BC, so it was close to home for me to get to learn about those similar ecosystems in Uganda. And when I had the opportunity to go down to Lake Victoria to hear how people had been restoring a really critical wetland habitat, not just for the wildlife there, but also for the humans who lived alongside it, I knew that was, I had to go.
Amazing. So we have climate smart agriculture in the midst of a drought, the women's cooperative, a wetland, three very diverse stories. But, first, in order to get to those stories, you had to leave the city where you were and go visit a community for the first time. And so what was it like visiting these communities, getting out of Kampala, out of Lusaka, which can be fairly metropolitan cities, and into these communities that you're covering stories? Maybe Everett, I'll go straight back to you.
There's always the cliche of the traffic, but I think one of the key things in Uganda is for a long time there was a bit of a disconnect in the public and also in the journalism side of things with the kind of urban rural farmer divide. The rural farming communities often were left out of the picture when people were discussing farming programs in the metropolitan city of Kampala. So I think it's really eye-opening just to get to leave that area and immediately go into other areas where you quickly start to see even the tribes of the different regions of Uganda quickly change for with every 20 or 30 minutes that you move across the country. There's dozens and dozens of different tribes and linguistic groups in the country. So seeing their needs change as you move north or east, I think that is a really key factor.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you, Everett. Sarah, you mentioned this grand tour that you did across the country. So what was it like for you going straight into these communities, kind of on 3 weeks at a time?
It was definitely a whole new experience. I think what helped actually is that the first time we left Lusaka was about 2 weeks into the summer. And we were visited by Tara and Charles, who also works for Farm Radio. And we got to do just a quick little one-off trip first before embarking on that whole 2 week adventure. And it was at that point we got to meet just the one community listening group that was based out of the Eastern Province. And I was a bit nervous because I was like, oh, I'm not sure what to expect. We knew that we would have to talk through a translator. And I was not sure how we were going to have those moments where in an interview you kind of connect with someone when you have to have a third party sort of negotiating that conversation with you. And I was really pleasantly surprised at how it was actually really possible to connect with people like that. And we were able to laugh with them. And that kind of really helped set the tone, I think, for all of the reporting that we did later on, where it was like, oh, okay, yeah, this isn't that different, actually. And we had to eventually learn to adapt, like maybe our question styles so that they made more sense in the local context and stuff like that. But it was nice when we got out of the city to just be able to find our footing and have a way to just be able to connect with people like that.
Yeah, that was a really remarkable community group. I'm sure the other ones that you visited were equally remarkable, but what it really struck me about that one was that there was a woman whose name was Sarah and seemed to immediately adopt Sarah into the group. And then as soon as they noticed that Adam was around, immediately started teasing Adam, which it was really fun to see. Lovely. So obviously, we didn't send you out into these communities alone. That would be kind of silly. In Farm Radio's projects, we always work with broadcasters. These are local professionals. They know the communities that they work in. They speak the languages of their community. They've built up relationships with community listening groups, with leadership, with individuals in these communities. And in some cases, these community listening groups or even members of these communities know the broadcasters by name because they've been listening to them for so long. And on top of that, these broadcasters are doing their own work on these stories about nature-based solutions themselves as part of the Nature-Based Solutions Project. So we don't have a broadcaster with us today. The time zones were a little bit challenging as we're doing this in the evening. But I'd like to ask you some questions about what it was like working with these broadcasters and maybe what you learned from them. So I'm going to pass the mic to Adam just to tell me a little bit about what it was like working with Farm Radio's broadcasting partners.
Yeah, of course. As Sarah mentioned before, we worked with MISA Zambia, the Media Institute of Southern Africa. And so I think we had a very unique experience because we not only got to work with, former journalists there, but also, as you said, like hyper local journalists, whether that be radio hosts or people that worked in the radio station. One thing that was really helpful was that not on every single occasion, but on the majority of occasions, we actually got to talk to the hosts ahead of time, like before we would visit a listening group. And we could kind of go over like, this is kind of what I'm thinking. And it was good to connect with the host as well, right? Because, they were, for the most part, acting as translators. And so if we had that shared understanding, it made it a lot easier when they kind of understood what I was going for. So if there wasn't an exact translation, I could trust the host to make that translation work. And it made everything smoother. I think it really helped convey like the emotion behind the questions and the answers. So I think working with them and learning all like the intricacies of radio journalism and like broadcast journalism was very, very cool.
Did you pick up any lessons from these broadcasters as you were there?
Yeah, I'd say Sarah mentioned this a bit earlier with like kind of fine-tuning the questions, but be exact with your questions. That was something that I kind of had to do on my feet, but I think I picked it up relatively quickly because, we all speak different languages, and each of those languages have small little bits that make up how we speak, how we ask questions, maybe even something like inflection, right? So really fine-tuning what your question is so it can be clear, and the person who you're interviewing can understand what you're asking, and also make sure that they can give a proper response, right? Because as journalists, the last thing we want to do is ask someone a question and then maybe they don't understand what I'm asking, and they don't give a correct answer, or they don't give an answer that they feel is appropriate.
Wonderful. Thanks, Adam. I should mention, I'm just going to jump in here and say we've mentioned community listening groups a few dozen times at this point, and I should say that community listening groups are often organized either by farm radio or by the radio station or by communities themselves as a way of listening to radio programs in community with each other. So farm radio's projects themselves, we often work with community listening groups that are set up in a way so that they can go and listen to a radio program that's supported by Farm Radio International, but they're also able to sit there and talk in their community about what they learned, what they think might work for them, what they think might not work for them. They might be able to, often we'll train them on the use of a radio set or a cell phone so that they can call in and give their feedback from those community groups to the radio station themselves. So just a note about what that means when we say community listening group. It's fairly active in most of the countries we work in, if not all. Going back to the broadcasters for a second, Everett, I know that you worked with our friends at Radio Simba in Uganda. So they're one of their broadcasters is a George Atkins Communication Award winner. And for those of you who don't know, Farm Radio gives out the George Atkins Communication Award every year to a broadcaster for their excellence in rural radio reporting. So I'm wondering, Everett, what was it like working with those broadcasters who've been such longstanding partners of Farm Radio, and how did they support you as you went around reporting on the wetlands?
Absolutely. Yeah, Mubiru Ali, he is a host for Radio Simba, the leading Luganda language radio station in Kampala and Uganda as a whole. It was an honor to meet him. He is a very thorough journalist, and I had the privilege of being able to profile him near the end of my time there to learn a bit about his background as not only a journalist, but also an educator. And a farmer, actually, a self-taught farmer. So he kind of knows all sides of these challenges that rural farmers are facing across Uganda. And he works in a tight-knit team with radio broadcaster Amaiko Martin. So Ali's more on the back end, and I got a glimpse of him kind of working on the back end of their radio documentary series, which is currently documenting a reforestation initiative that's been happening over the last couple of years in a community in central Uganda, a couple hours from Kampala, called Gingo, where they've been able to reforest about 100 acres of forest, the swath of forest that was reduced from about 365 square kilometers, or acres, sorry, to just about 10, I think 10 acres were left. So a really powerful initiative, and they've been able to document that without even using video, just with the pure power of audio. Ali is a super thorough journalist. He told me he collected 6 hours of audio for, these 30-minute segments. So they're really going out there and capturing everything they can. And he is very quick with the fingers in terms of slicing up the audio to put together some really compelling episodes. And also seeing him in the interview room hosting his shows. He's a very thoughtful and sensitive broadcaster with anyone who walks in that door.
Did you have any major takeaways or lessons that you learned from him as you were there?
Absolutely. And I should mention his friend Martin as well, because being in the field with Martin, and when we were in Gingo, for example, we had a focus group, a listening group we were set up with, and there must have been about 18 locals from that community, men, women, elders, younger folks, and even some others with children in their arms. And Martin interviewed every single person there. he took his time with them. He gave them equal time. He could often be seen laughing with them and kind of starting the conversation with a lighthearted joke. He did not discriminate. He wanted to include all the voices there. And I think that is definitely something we miss out on in Canada in our own coverage when we're covering communities impacted by these sorts of things. So that was really special. And I think Ali had some really fascinating teachings as well. I think just how thorough he was with his reporting and the background knowledge he brought as a farmer. Of course, he also, I think, just taught me to really come at this with a lot of humility. My first interaction with Ali was when we were at a workshop with a bunch of journalists across Uganda who'd come to Kampala to work on to develop these radio documentaries. And my first time actually speaking with Ali, he heard me trying to say the word ask for water in Luganda, and his first interaction with me was correcting me on my pronunciation. So he humbled me right from the beginning, taught me to not take myself too seriously and to come at my time in Uganda, my work with all the people I spoke with, and had the privilege of meeting with a lot of humility. So
Lovely. I should also note that Ali was chosen to work at a pop-up radio station that Farm Radio led at the Food and Agriculture Organization's World Food Forum in Rome in October. So it's a very well-established group of broadcasters there that you were working with. So I've mentioned the podcast a few times now, but you all have a special sneak peek for us into what you were reporting on this summer. So I'm going to go through each of you, ask you to set the scene, tell us a little bit about what your episode is about, why you picked the moment that we're going to hear from. We're going to hear some actual audio from your reporting, and tell us a little bit about what it is that we're going to hear. So I'm going to start with Adam. If you can lead the way telling us about your episode and the story.
Yeah, of course. So my episode, as I've mentioned before, was about the Malili Women's Cooperative. And this is an all-women's listening group in Chikankata. And what really was the through line for me was how this group formed. As individual farmers, they noticed that the drought was having a very negative impact on their crop yields, maize in particular, which was the chief crop that they all would grow. And they started, they took action, to put it simply. They started coming together, they started listening to the radio, and they started meeting, discussing different farming techniques, things like intercropping, which meant not only planting and harvesting one type of crop, but rather multiple, or using different kinds of trees that had been proven to help soil fertility. And initially what stood out to me was those like farming techniques. But as I kept, talking to them, interviewing them as a group or individuals, I started to really notice the importance of their group. And not only were they an all women's listening group, but they also kind of became role models for their town, right? Like they started teaching other people. They started offering essentially like seminars and lessons on the farming techniques that they found worked. And they were the first group to do that. And so they felt that it was more important to do that than whatever ridicule they might have faced or whatever kind of pushback they might have faced, right? So for me, my episode begins as kind of a look into their farming techniques, but it really ends with who they are as a group and what it means for their group to even exist.
So can you just tell us who we're about to hear from?
Yeah, so it's actually the woman pictured with the white shirt that says Day. Her name is Rosanna Malambo. She's well, they didn't formally have a head of the group. She was the organizer. It was her farm where they would meet. This is a picture taken at her farm. And she really spoke to not only the struggles that they kind of began with, but also how they as women were particularly affected by the drought and by the new farming techniques.
As women, we are the one who struggles in our families, because everything depends on the mothers. Even cooking, looking for firewood, we ask the mothers. So we are very important. So that's why we have to encourage our fellow women to do the same. The maize became dry, but in my field, as if someone is watering the maize. The maize are dying. So many of them thought that leaping destroys maize. Water can't stay there. That's why they normally using jirimelime. They don't know the benefits of what? Of leaping method. What
gives us courage as a group, especially women? We look at the role we play in the program and we feel free to express ourselves. Some time back, women were not given time to voice out on anything, even when they had problems in their farming. We were told to keep quiet, but this time around, everything changed. We have shown everyone that we can also be trusted. Even with finances, we know how to use money.
So there's some really compelling audio there. You can really see why this group stood out to you. Hey?
Yeah, I think and, you know, I could sing their praises all day, but what really stuck out to me is like essentially in that third clip, right? You hear it's like, well, yeah, like people are telling us to be quiet, but like if we do that, what happens? Right? Like the reliance that they feel from their families, it's like it's too great. Like, you know, they'll endure all of that ridicule or all the people telling them to stop because they have to. Like they love their families. They want to, you know, be able to provide for their children, their husbands, sisters, distant relatives, anyone, right? So that idea of coming together as a group and recognizing that you have a shared goal and, you know, pushing through whatever struggles you have together, right? Like very much in the way that eventually a seed will break through tough soil. This group was able to break through all of those barriers of apprehension in their community to really, you know, spread their method and to teach people that like this will help you. Like we're doing this because this is correct and this will help you.
Lovely. I look forward to hearing the full episode. Everett, tell us a little bit about your podcast and what we are about to hear.
Absolutely. So I had the privilege of driving down about an hour and a half on the coast of Lake Victoria, outside of Kampala. So the local community there of Ziba, they are just on the edge of Mabamba wetland or Mabamba swamp, which is a really critical site for migratory bird life, hundreds of different species actually. And so who you're about to hear is Joseph Chimbagaya. He is just slightly older than me actually, but he originally came to Mabamba about 10 years ago just to visit his sister. He was moving from eastern Uganda, but he fell in love with the bird life there, and he saw a lot of potential to actually improve the wetland and its ecological conditions due to given the fact that human activity there had begun to degrade the quality of the water and also reduce the size of the forest significantly. But he also realized that people could be having a lot more love for the ecological diversity there, having more respect for the birds, and also thinking of ways to work with that to be able to kind of have a symbiotic relationship. So out of that came a lot of ecotourism operations that are quite compatible with the environment there and have also helped the community kind of build back up and become more successful ecologically and financially. So yes, feel free to play the clip.
This place, Mawamba Wetland itself, is a stopover for migratory species. Actually, they're still coming even up to now. Like blue swallow, as I told you, is a migratory species from South Africa. They always come here in early April and they go back in September. We have gulls that also migratory from Europe to here. Nature Uganda started to use me as a freelancer to do water body counting in 2 different parts of Uganda. Then I get more interest. At first it was my hobby. From there, it turned into an economic activity. That's when I had to train to become a serious bird guide. This water is very, very important to everyone because due to the presence of this water, it has created job opportunity. Because this water, for instance, there is a lot of vegetation which could survive because of water, and that vegetation in there is a home to many species or creatures. And even by the time I came here, nobody has ever seen a younger shoebill or even a single egg. But right now, we're lucky. Of recently, we've seen 3 pairs with the chicks. So they're multiplying because this area is well protected and people are no longer stoning it.
And just for context, the shoebill that he mentions at the end, it's a big gray colored stork that's very important and for the ecosystem there, and also a very rare bird that's only really found in somewhere like Uganda. So it's become a focal point of ecotourism operations there. And like you said, thanks to restoration of the water quality there and regrowth of the surrounding forest and vegetation, and also sensitization of the population to respect these birds. They're slowly kind of coming back in numbers, which is fantastic.
Lovely. Thank you, Everett. Finally, Sarah, can you tell us a little bit about your episode and the clip that you're about to share?
Sure. So yeah, our assignment last summer was to produce 1 episode, but my story kind of ended up snowballing into something bigger. So we ended up splitting it into 3 different episodes. Because my focus, once I met Cornwell, I decided to focus my episode on the power of mentorship in enacting the nature-based solutions that we were going to look for. And so throughout like the time that we were in Choma, Cornwell was like, oh, let's go meet this women's group that I mentored. Let's go meet the chief, the traditional chief of the area. Let's go meet this young farmer that I mentored through sustainable agriculture. And we also met a research institute team and a local NGO that was helping people recover from alcohol addiction through sort of entrepreneurship, and they were making the sort of soil and enhancer from manure and charcoal. So he's a busy man, but he's actually retired. He's a social worker by training, and he retired to go on to farming, which is a fairly common retirement plan in Zambia from the people we talked to, at least. And so it made me curious, like, how come is he spending so much time and energy still trying to get this thing off the ground as much when he's supposed to be in his retirement years? But he explained to me that the reason why he cares so much about this is about reducing food insecurity in his community. And so the clip that I have here is explaining why.
Food is life. And when there's no food in a home, there's this serious insecurity. First of all, women and the children are the ones who suffer because they have no other source of income to raise their food. So food insecurity is very, very important to me because it affects the entire family. Husband normally would go away, visit town, they eat something, but they will not consider the children. But a woman, even if she has to buy a loaf of bread, she will hide it for a child. So the growth of the children is very important because those are the future generation. It's the country. Women, when there's insecurity in the food insecurity in the home, it means that love is no longer there in that home. There's no peace. There's a lot of fighting, and the children are the ones who suffer. And when children suffer, it reminds me of old days. They'll be back in the street, selling on the street, begging on the street, early marriages on the street. So it hurts me somehow. So food insecurity is not something we should encourage at all.
Yeah, I think he said it all, but that's really just one of the things he said while we were there that really stuck with me. And so that this is from the first of the 3 episodes. If you want to learn more about all of this, feel free to check them out when they come out.
Thanks so much, Sarah. You beat me to it. I was just going to say that you can subscribe to Nature Answers by searching Nature Answers wherever you get your podcasts. We have a season out already. We're planning our second season. And you can find individual episodes on our website at farmradio.org/natureanswers. We'll soon be releasing episodes on YouTube as well. And the next season is set to be launched at the end of January. So check in then to hear all of these amazing stories that Everett, Adam, Sarah, and the rest of their cohort have produced. I'm going to ask you one last question, then we'll go to the audience for some questions. But did telling these stories change your outlook on climate change reporting? Maybe Sarah, I'll jump to you first.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for myself, at least coming from the background of having studied international development studies for my undergrad, I had this sort of like more academic framework of how like solutions to climate change and stuff like that. And like I spent a lot of time looking at the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the sort of that slew of things. And without going there this summer, I don't think I could have understood just how foundational water is to everything, like access to water. And seeing how through the drought, not having access to that had just like, it was making people do really tough decisions on the regular. And it sort of reframed it to me, at least for climate change reporting, as not just something that's happening, but just like look at the daily consequences of it. And it's one thing that things are warming up and everything, but then after that, you end up with people who are bearing the brunt end of it. And who are having to choose between watering their crops and maybe like giving their children a bath at the end of the day. But it was also really encouraging, or I don't know about, well, yes, encouraging to see people like Cornwell who were just so willing to take it head on and who weren't discouraged by climate change and were seeing opportunities for improvement on old ways by adapting to it as well.
Mm-hmm. Everett, how about you? Did this experience change your outlook on either climate change or climate reporting?
Absolutely. It was a refreshing reminder to me that we should give more credit to some solutions that I think we're quick to underrate in Canada. Things like tree planting. I know that comes up a lot in a country like Canada that's already very tree rich, and I think sometimes we might roll our eyes that that's the solution people are putting forward. But in the end, in that example, we need those carbon sinks and we need that oxygen. And it's being able to amplify possible solutions like that in some parts of Uganda is a much more accessible option for a lot of people in these communities than some options that we're maybe more oriented towards in Canada in terms of types of energy sources. So I think just being able to take each solution that communities put forward at face value for what it's worth is really crucial. And that's something that I'm going to keep with me in my mind as I continue reporting on climate in places like Canada.
Thanks so much, Everett. How about you, Adam? Anything to add about how this has changed your outlook on climate change and climate reporting?
Yeah, I think it's really easy to kind of get lost in the headlines of biggest wildfire in the past 10 years, or record highs this summer, or the fact that there's no snow in Ottawa right now and it's mid-November, right? But one thing that really stuck out to me, and you hear it a bit in the clips that were played for my episode, but in I believe all of our episodes, is how happy these people were that what they were doing was working. Like there's a very tangible sense of pride that came with the interviews and just getting them to tell us about their experiences. And so I think for me, remembering that there are solutions, and more importantly, there are people enacting those solutions, right? That like it's not just headlines telling you that the world is on fire. There are people making a real material difference in a positive way. And so I think whenever I see a story that might have a very doom and gloom look, so to speak, on climate change, it's really easy now for me to remember that there is still hope. There are still people doing things that are affecting positive change.
It's true that these are some of the most vulnerable communities on Earth. They're some of the communities that have contributed the least to climate change, and yet here they are day to day taking up new solutions, trying things, and it's working. And they're really finding success in this. And so thank you so much for sharing that. A reminder to people in the audience, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box. We're going to take a couple of them before we wrap up. So Catherine has a question for Adam, and she's wondering, you talk about working with this women's community group. Was it a problem for you given that the group was exclusively for women?
Not at all. I think it was really fun. Like they were all amazing. They were all such engaging people. I interviewed some of them one-on-one and everyone as a group. So there was no issues going between those. I really thought that it was just such a cool opportunity for me to, speak to this group and get to tell their story, right? Because I think it is particularly important to have an all women's group be highlighted in this way. So I think even if there had been problems, we would have made it work. But no, I had no issues with them.
Amazing. Lovely. They sound very welcoming. A question from Jeff LaRock. So Everett, you mentioned growing up near a wetland in BC, but he's wondering if any of the three of you have had any direct experience of rural life or farming prior to this trip, and whether or not you have, what was your biggest takeaway of either the similarities or differences between your understanding of rural agricultural life in Canada and the places that you visited this summer? I don't know if one of you wants to jump in here.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up next to a farm and I lived there for most of my life. I have no direct experience with farming. I never lived on a farm myself, but growing up in Battersea, which is this small rural town about 30 minutes north of Kingston, the biggest thing that I've noticed is that farming in Canada, having the experience of being in Zambia, is very individualized. It's very, this is a farmer's land. This is that family's farm. They do the work. Whereas based on my experiences, farming in Africa is very communal. It is not only a place for the community to come together, but also to, to turn a phrase, reap what they sow, like to really connect and work together to provide for everyone. So I'd say that was what struck me the most.
Lovely. Yeah, anyone else want to add to that? No pressure. Oh, go ahead, Sarah. You unmuted, so.
Yeah, I don't have much more because I was also in Zambia, but I grew up in rural Quebec, so it wasn't I have had some proximity to farming. My friend, the neighbor across the street from me growing up was a cornfield. So I've had some experiences, but it was kind of different in terms of like the small scale farming. A lot of it in Zambia is subsistence agriculture as well. I think if I remember the stats properly from this summer, it's around 80% of the country that relies on subsistence agriculture, which is pretty different from here. And so sometimes just the gardens that they would have during the dry season would look more like 3 times the size of my mother's garden growing up, as opposed to like something that was comparable to the fields that I was used to.
Thank you. I'm gonna run to a couple other questions here. So all three of you mentioned these solutions that you heard from the different communities that you were working in. Brenda is posing this question. Do you know if the information got aired, that similar information that you were hearing for your stories and you were hearing people adapt to, was that also getting aired on the local radio stations? I have the answer to this if you don't.
I can go maybe for that. I know so for a lot of the things that we were seeing, the groups that we were seeing, the local broadcasters had done their own documentaries with people in their communities, and we were kind of like brought into some of those stories. I know for me personally, I don't think they had one on Cornwall, but Cornwall was one of their experts that they would bring in to talk on the NBS solution. So he has his own standing show with Baita FM in Choma, where he like once a week takes questions and people call in and he shares his expertise that way. So there's very much a link between what we were reporting on and the local radio stations.
Amazing, lovely. I'm going to jump ahead. We're running a little bit out of time here. So I'd like each of you to take 1 minute, summarize a favorite moment that you had in each country. Maybe I'll start Adam, then Everett, then Sarah.
Yeah, I think I remember very distinctly. It was after one of the first like group interviews that we had done. And it was I remember turning to Sarah and essentially like in a state of like glee, being like, this is real. Like, we got off the plane 2 weeks ago, but like it's real. Like, and I remember that like almost like electric feeling of like recognizing why I was here and like what I came here to do, right? Like to work with these people and to collaborate and to really share these stories. And I think for me, that moment still sticks with me to this day and still, gets me kind of caught up a bit because I'm like, like, wow, I think that's the only way I can say it. Wow.
Amazing. Thank you, Adam. Everett, your favorite moment in a minute?
So many. One that really stood out for me was when I had the opportunity to sit in on a meeting with local farm radio international members and representatives from Uganda's Ministry of Gender, where they were having some really important discussions about unpaid care work, which is a huge issue in Uganda in particular, where too often women are disproportionately burdened with extra uncompensated labor, usually related to the house and taking care of other people and their families or the community. And there was some really kind of important progress being made in those discussions and some kind of proposals put forward with some action that will hopefully be reaching the national government in the coming months. We just actually passed the second annual International Day of Unpaid Care which is recognized now by the United Nations. And, you know, these conversations also came up a lot in our workshops with the local journalists across Uganda, where we started to realize that even in the rooms that we were working in, sometimes there was a bit of a gender imbalance or a lack of respect there for the woman working in these environments. So I think even in a place like Uganda, they're getting really good at bringing in keynote speakers, women who have experience talking about these issues and how we can push for more equality and give more space for women's voices in these radio dialogues as well. So I'm really looking forward to seeing the progress that comes forward.
Thanks, Everett. And Sarah, last word over to you.
Yeah, I have a whole bunch of moments that feel pretty memorable, but since I know we have an unanswered question still from Catherine about a follow-up to something that she asked Adam earlier about whether the women of the group were uncomfortable maybe working with him, because one of the things I liked the most or that struck me the most this summer was when we were working with these women's groups, at least the ones we met, they were pretty vocal themselves about how being in this group had sort of brought their confidence levels up. One of the groups we met, one of their leader was saying how before being in this group, she wouldn't have been comfortable speaking up in sort of a group discussion as we were having if there was a man who was an authority figure around. But now, like, they had each other's back in a way, and they had raised themselves up. And so with the group that Adam worked, it was kind of a similar situation as well. And we could see the difference because it's not like there were different relations everywhere. And sometimes we were just meeting with a single couple maybe. And you could tell sometimes that the wife wasn't as comfortable speaking up until like I got to be alone with her and a female translator, and then some things would come out that hadn't come out before. And I really liked being a woman in that situation and being able to kind of like have those conversations that wouldn't have been had otherwise. So that's one of the things that has stayed with me.
Lovely. I want to thank all three of you for both your time tonight and your time and your work this summer. I really hope that you got as much out of the experience as we did. To our audience, keep an eye out for these three as they continue on with their journalism careers, and indeed the 8 other students that we worked with this summer as their episodes come out this spring on the podcast. As Kevin mentioned, I also got to visit some of the communities that are adapting to climate change earlier this summer. And there were 2 things that were really striking to me. The first was that in every community I visited, whether it was Zambia in Southern Africa or all the way across the continent in Cote d'Ivoire in West Africa, every single person we talked to mentioned climate change. In Zambia, they were in the middle of their worst drought in 40 years, as Sarah has mentioned. While I was in Cote d'Ivoire, there were literal flood warnings. But the other thing was that each of the communities we visited were also talking about the successes they were having in adapting to climate change. And in part, they were telling us that that was due to these radio programs that they were hearing. In Zambia, we visited a community who'd started a small tree nursery because of the radio programs, and they were testing literally new ways of planting their crops so as to better catch and conserve water on their fields. One woman literally told us how she had tested the new way that she'd learned on the radio side by side with her crops and was seeing how much it was making a change. In Cote d'Ivoire, we met a woman who was already running a tree nursery and how she was using the radio programs to amplify her own success in her tree planting programs so that other farmers could take part in them, so that they could shade their fields, reforest parts of their communities. It really struck me again and again and again that despite the changing climate, these communities and these individuals were adapting and finding success in those adaptations. And these are the stories that not only Adam and Sarah and Everett are able to share on our podcast, Nature Answers, but that the broadcasters that we've mentioned earlier are also telling stories about and sharing on their own local programs so that their neighbors can hear about them and learn from them. Farm Radio International hopes to continue to expand these programs so that more rural communities in more countries are able to learn from what their neighbors are doing when it comes to climate change adaptation and test out those things themselves. And we can only do that thanks to you. So please, if you have some spare change this holiday season, please consider donating either by the link that someone is about to put in the chat or by going to farmradio.org/donate. every penny counts. But once again, please let me extend a warm thank you to everyone who has already donated, to our student guests here this evening, Adam, Sarah, Everett, to Global Affairs Canada, to the teams at Farm Radio and MISA Zambia who hosted these students this summer, and to the team that is helping me behind the scenes, Eleanor Wilner-Fraser, Blair Amiot, Christian Robillard, and of course, the wonderful Brenda Jackson, who you've seen in the chat earlier this evening. I hope everyone has a lovely evening. Thank you so much for spending your Tuesday with us. We hope you have a wonderful night. Thanks so much.